Okay, seeing a quorum of voting members, I call the February 1st Cincinnati School Board meeting to order. Treasurer Wagner, please call the attendance roll.
Mr. Craig,
Here.
Mr. Crossett,
Here.
Mr. Lindy, Ms. Mapp, Mrs. Weinberg,
Here.
Vice President Bolton,
Present.
President Moffett.
Here. Okay, we have come out of exec session and now are at the point of our agenda. For Superintendent Murphy, please present your topic.
I believe I'm on the agenda for my goals.
Yes, ma'am.
Everything off. So after our last conversation, I did make a couple of adjustments. You know why? Just based on some feedback. So the sheet coming around will look a little different. From last week, I had two separate sheets, but I decided to combine the sheets into one, following the Ohio standards for superintendents. So you'll see goal one, or the area one, vision, continuous improvement, and focus on district work. Area two, communication and collaboration. Area three, policies and governance. Then instruction is where I slid the 5 goals from the goals and guardrails in our strategic plan. There was some suggestion after the meeting, maybe about the rigor of the goal. Understanding the goal I shared with you again was as it was suggested to me. And so the goal 1 around 3rd grade reading, you'll see, I hope you can see that's blue, is a shift based on some feedback. Goal 3, algebra 1 in the blue, there's a shift. So this is a change from Monday. And then the next goal is the same around College Credit Plus. The next is around workforce credentials. And then the final one around graduation, you'll see a shift there. I didn't have the X value. I think Board Member Mapp asked me about the last time.
Is this on board docs? No. No, not yet.
No, I apologize because I think I just worked on these again.
That's okay. So this was actually at the request of one of the board members to do this in public. So thank you for providing this information. The board still has to finalize it for the public to know. That's why it's not there, because this is still a work in progress. And so, board members, do you have any questions? Board member Craig.
I don't really have any questions. I just want to say thank you for taking the time to make the adjustments and based on the feedback. I think it is a very creative way to add the what we have all talked about as being instructional goals for the district, but to putting them into the instruction portion of the standards kind of also is in a lot of ways aligning what the state has offered out as ways to think about it as to also what we're tasked to do on a more dedicated level. So it's like a specific goal around instruction that is a much easier way to measure than some of the other state standard stuff. So I appreciate you taking the time to do so.
Thank you.
Any other board members, questions or comments? Board member Crossett.
I wanted to talk just briefly about possibly adding a goal for next year, not for now, but to tee up the topic. We had a nice presentation from Dr. Smith on instructional rounds, which is this giant document that talks about how well the curriculum is being used and that utilization of that report. And it is a report that's pretty measurable. And I thought we've got this in the policy, we've got this 10% where we're supposed to be checking in. I thought this might be a good tool to think about being able to measure how well we're checking in with how it goes. So just throwing that out there as an idea for next year. The other topic that I thought I would like to introduce is, I appreciate that you put in these blue numbers to move the goals up based on the progress that we've made already. But I think part of our annual calendar should be when we get to September or October, when the report comes out, that would be the right timing to reassess where these goals should be in terms of the percentages for 3rd grade reading or percentages for Algebra 1, that sort of thing, and reassess it at that time and not necessarily reassess it now. I don't want to feel like we're putting a superintendent in a position where we're moving the goalposts in the middle of the game. So just from an annual calendar standpoint, that might be a good timing to reassess those goals rather than, I realize it's our first year and we're just doing this. And it's a 3-year rolling average, so it's not just all based on the numbers from 1 year, but still, that's just a couple suggestions.
Board Member Crossett, are you wanting to change the policy around that? Because I think, does the policy say October? I'm looking at the policy committee. So are you suggesting that we move that date from October to September and the policy?
No, the policy doesn't need to change. I just think we might need to add something. Maybe it's a policy addition that we revisit the goals right after the report card comes out, like the timing of that. Could all coincide pretty close, don't you think? Yeah.
So, yeah, from my understanding in terms of the policy, that is actually kind of why we decided upon October, is because we'll actually have all of the state data to be able to assess how to actually evaluate the superintendent's goals overall. So I guess, what is your suggestion around September?
Well, it could be October.
Okay, so yeah, so I think the initial, once we really begin to implement the policy overall, the expectation is for it to align with that October date.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Yes, ma'am, Board Member Weinberg. Vice President Bolton.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this document. I'm good with the number 4 and how you've inserted the particular goals that are the ones that have been established and we've been living with. The change in numbers, were the previous numbers what had been on the our targets?
Yes, yes, ma'am. The numbers in the parentheses were the actual targets from the strategic plan.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then you've upped them in a couple. Just like you did in number 4, is it possible, not tonight or today, but is it possible then for the board to have you do some inserts in 1, 2, and 3 and 5, the same way you've done sort of with the goals in 4, meaning what would be those items in those, like, okay, for your continuous improvement and focus district work, what would be the 3 or 4, or it doesn't have to be 4 or 5, but to give us an idea of specifically, so it's not so much we're trying to grade you, if you will, or evaluate you on this broad scope, but that there are some specifics within each of these other standards that you would like us to think about or hold you accountable.
Would you? Yes, I definitely can do that. Would you be expecting them to be written as a SMART goal with an X to Y value as the instructional goals are? And my rationale for that is, in my first few months, I would not necessarily have a baseline, but I definitely know that I can provide you with items for 1, 2, 3, and 5.
I think when it would be applicable, being a SMART goal, that would be
Okay.
great. When it's not, because of the nature of it, it wouldn't be, but I think that you should make an effort to make it a SMART goal. If the particular topic that you're choosing would work.
My 2 cents would be that it'd be a SMART goal, just make sure that that's consistent across the board. I think on some level, all of them can be SMART goals. It's just, it may be worded differently, but I think that with regard to SMART goals, that was good to say that, just to be consistent. Whatever map you had a question or comment.
So yes, I agree with the SMART goal approach, just to ensure that we are able to measure what we're actually working on in terms of, well, you're able to measure what we're working on in terms of the goals. And I do also like the feedback that Vice President Bolton gave around giving more context to those other areas. I do appreciate how the goals have been integrated into the instructional aspect. My question is, and I know this is something, I guess, for us still as a board, as we determine what it looks like under the scoring measures. Are you, but just to ask you, are you anticipating us score all of these as one collective, or would you still like, well, as the policy is written, the measurables will be separated out as one particular scoring method. So I'm just looking for your kind of rationale with the integration here.
If I had my dream, when I think about how we score our principals, when I think about how we score our administrators here at central office, if I had my dream, I am saying all 5 of these in the eyes of the state are important for a superintendent. I believe the same, which is why I asked if those could be considered. I would love it if they could be considered or weighted evenly in the overall evaluation of my work as a complete body of work.
Okay. And then my last question is around goal 5, for the credits for graduation will increase. I know the baseline was 80.8% to by this year 85%. Correct me if I'm wrong, if last year's state report card graduation rate was at 83.3%. So I'm wondering, are you possibly able to anticipate more growth then? So because that would be like 1.7 percentage point difference.
So just a reminder on graduation rate too, the reason I would advocate for keeping it there, it truly will not be a reflection of my work because graduation rate is the one thing on the report card that lags. So I only used the 80.8 because the last meeting Monday, I was missing that
Right.
X value. So I am not sure that it would be higher than the 85%.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay. And just one final question to that, and maybe this is something that you can speak to at a later time, since there's that uncertainty there. Is there a way, well, I know there's a way, but do you feel comfortable with providing us with an update on where we are maybe presently tracking in terms of
Sure.
reaching this
Yes,
said goal or maybe surpassing it?
yes.
Graduation. Okay.
And just to be clear, the goal for 5A is the credit folks who are in 10th grade who are on
On track.
track to grad.
Right.
And I know that that's wanted for historically, we've been below where the actual graduation rate ends up being because we have a number of students who do not get on point until like last semester, they senior year. So I do appreciate you kind of looking at that specific part because truly is the graduation rate is generally not as reflective of where we currently are on the report card and the numbers we have as where we are looking at students who are currently on track. So I appreciate you kind of differentiating, even though that is the goal on our goal thing.
And that still is a goal. Graduation rate is still a goal. But I'm pleased and happy to work on whatever direction pleases the board.
Board Member Cross.
I think there's I could be wrong, but I feel like there's a next level of scoring that needs to be addressed. In other words, I mean, I'd like to see like these goals have some scoring of like a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 or something like that. And if you get to, as Ben suggested at the last meeting, like if you get to 80%, maybe that's a 4, 70% is a 3, something along those lines. I think in trying to calculate this numerically, we need some method to address that in some path. Maybe we don't decide that today. I just didn't want it to not be noticed. Same with the standards. They could be graded and it's sort of like a report card, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 or something like that.
Vice President.
Yeah, anything that keeps us from doing satisfactory and unsatisfactory, because I'm not living through that again. That was just unacceptable. So I like the idea of having different places to go with that. But I don't want to use the state as any standard regarding 80%, because if you get an 80% or so graduation rate in the state of Ohio as a school district, you get an F.
Well, yeah,
But I'm just making that point
sure.
because I always make that point about how you can achieve this graduation rate of 80% with a highly mobile, very diverse, very urban school district, and still that 80%, which I think is a phenomenal achievement, frankly, under all circumstances, is for the state. They see it because they're measuring it against 570 suburban and rural districts. And so an 80% graduation rate for us is literally an F. So that's something just to keep in mind. So I'm thrilled that we have some high school goals on here too.
So we've got the superintendent's goals. Are there any other questions around that? Comments? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Just one thing for me, just as a request for your consideration, and whatever the scoring method is a request that it just be something holistic that the board does as one, and not 7 individual assessments, if that's possible to consider.
Comments, questions?
It's the only authority we have is together.
All right. Okay, so I'm sure we will have this topic brought back up
Again and again.
on some level, but today we're moving on. So, Superintendent Murphy and Treasurer Wagner, it is time now for you both to present your growth and sustainability topics. I believe these presentations are on board docs, right? For the public to look. All right. Take it over. Take it away.
So I think the first topic, phase 1 actuals, was the document. Ms. Bolton wanted to go over that one.
Yes, this is just a reminder. There's a couple of documents here. The treasurer has worked out the money part of phase 1, but I just wanted to remind the board and the public of what it was included in phase 1, which was pretty remarkable. And that was the repurposing of Riverview, the expansion of Mount Washington to a PK8, moved in order to grow Spencer, we moved him to Riverview, combined the Owens and Promise Center into one building, moved Schroeder 7th and 8th to former Lighthouse building, thus creating the first of our new junior highs, Schroeder Junior High. And in some near future, I think it'd be great for the board to hear a report as to how that move to a junior high at Schroeder would be good, but we can save that for assignments. Schroeder became a 912, and then we started to make the Zoo Academy district-wide as part of the whole career piece, and then gave choice cluster options to urging of President Moffett over a number of years to the PRM families being able to go to some of the other schools that are close in that same cluster. And then we created Bramble, and we said in the midst of phase 1 that its position and its status and use would be to be determined. So they just wanted to remind us of all that was done, and the treasurer has money to talk about, or at least a document that has demonstrated the cost of that. So turn it back to the treasurer.
So before we switch to the slide deck, do you want to go over, I know there was concerns about the votes document.
Before we do that, yes, there was a question by
I'm sorry.
Board Member Weinberg.
So I don't really have a question, just kind of a statement and a request, but Vice President Bolton, you stated that you wanted to have a update provided about Schroeder and just the high school. I personally think that we should have an update on every single thing on this particular sheet, because it gives us an idea of where we're going, and just to give us some data pieces as well.
Great idea. Is that going to be an
So we can
assignment to
save that
the
for the assignment piece.
Put that in as an assignment.
How do you repeat that when we get to the Board Member Craig?
I just want to and again, we'll bring it up in part of this assignment also, but just want to give a preview that I do think it'll be also important for us to look at what the attendance and enrollment numbers look like, both the start and then where we currently are. And because I think that goes a little bit also to whether or not some of the projects that we're looking at in phase 2 that we've already, as a board, approved, how we would adjust or have to make, we'll have to make changes to or have to think about, because we do end up with places where we may have differences in where the enrollment ends up at or lands at, that may affect how we project what other schools would be looking at going forward. So I will certainly make that as part of an assignment later, but and then also wanted to reiterate appreciation for sharing the information on where our current facilities look like, because I think that also incorporates some of the changes that we've made in that phase 1. So
Thank you, board members. I would like, is it possible that we could get it on one, yeah, here I come, with like one sheet or one rolling sheet where we can kind of see to their questions, enrollment, beginning phase, prior to phase 1 implementation, what the enrollment numbers are, whatever the data is that we're looking for. Can we get that just maybe on one sheet? Or just one way to see the information so that it's, I think preferably a spreadsheet, but when we're looking at where we were to where we are, it's easier for me to see it in that measurement. I don't know if you all are would like that, but that's what is helpful for me. So that I can actually see the growth and I can actually see the expenses. I can actually see, okay, well, it did cost us 5 million, but we're gonna save 10 or something like that, whatever the numbers are. That's just a preference in how I look at it. Yes, ma'am.
Just to follow up on that, is the list that is before us, which is really not anything more than notes, not in great form. Is there anything else to add to phase 1 off of that list that is before us that I missed? I don't know if administration or union folks or anybody picked up anything. I think we captured most of it. And I know some of this is still in, I won't say process, but still evolving. Does that look like what this is phase 1? Okay. And we want the data about each of those, and preferably on one sheet. Okay. I love it.
I'm just, this is just how I look at it. When I look at, excuse me, repurposing Riverview, I'm not gonna go down each one, but like there was a cost of what Riverview was prior to the capacity of that building. And then I'm looking at with Spencer adding to Riverview, that capacity is increased, the cost may be similar, but where's the savings at? So that's how I'm envisioning looking at that. When you combine 1 and 3, move to grow Spencer. So now Spencer's building or their expenses were this, now they're currently this, they have a capacity of X. That's what I'm thinking of. And
That's
again,
good.
that is just, I think some of those up there combined Owens and Promise Center. Promise Center was at the Jacobs Center. Owens was the Lighthouse. So again, those were 2 separate buildings coming to one. Now that money and that capacity, those numbers look different. So that's what I'm interested in seeing.
Excellent.
Of course, board members can add whatever they're interested in, but I'm interested in looking at, for the Zoo Academy specifically, how many were we able to service? Now we can accommodate more students. So I'm looking at that type of data to be able to share. Any other questions or
I
comments?
think it's great.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
So the other document that Ms. Bolton published was the votes on each of the bundles. And earlier you had commented that you thought there was a change to the document. I don't know, Rob, if you can pull that up. The votes document.
So for me, there was just, and I know I heard from at least one other
That
board
one, yeah.
member who expressed wanting to go back and expand on at least one of our areas. We didn't decide on what would happen with regard to Taft Elementary. And it was in a bundle. So you'll have to make that just a little bit bigger. Eyes are not that keen.
So I did go back and verify that that is the document I sent out on December 16th
Yes.
with the orange text on it, because you were concerned about.
No, what I was saying is that there, in the document from the December 9th meeting, there was orange text added that was not in that original document. And so, and I went back and looked at it, and some of it was crossed out, and I appreciate that, but some of it gave an inference that may or may not been consistent with what was discussed at that meeting. So that's where I wanted to finalize.
So the corrected version was sent out on December 16th with that text in it. That
Okay.
is,
So the orange, like, stay right there, Rob. The orange number 14, the board supports additional conversations around an additional early college program and or other useful programs with local universities. So you're saying that was in the original one, or that was in the amended one? I'm sorry.
it was the corrected version, right? So the first one I sent, I had to send out a correction. I sent the correction out on December 16th, and that's what I highlighted were my changes.
Okay, go down. I'm specifically interested in the Taft Elementary discussion.
Okay. So I
myself.
may have captured it wrong, but I just wanted to confirm that that was the same language.
Okay,
Okay.
so when we say, I know I did not, as a board member, know that we finalized Taft Elementary becoming a Montessori.
It's
If
bundled-
I could stand corrected on that, because we
It-
had board members go back and listen to it.
Okay.
So,
It's bundle 24, Rob. So I wrote that's what I wrote, what it says there is Rising Stars at Vine is pre-K only. Taft receives the wrap, has no magnet status, no transportation. Taft PK6 will possible startup of an elementary Montessori neighborhood school.
okay, so for me personally, I don't remember removing K through 6 students from Taft Elementary.
You
Is that
didn't.
what-
People, I think what you said is they could stay if they wanted to stay,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah.
And feel welcome.
They just want to get transportation.
Okay, I also said, where are the other, because what was said was 60 of those students will qualify to go to Rockdale. And I asked, where would the other students go? Because there's approximately 200 and some odd students at that school. And the answer was wherever they wanted to go. That's not an answer to me. So where are those students going to go? We never really finished that conversation definitively that I heard, and I could very well be mistaken, but I did not hear that Taft students were to go wherever they wanted to go. I heard that I thought we needed to make a definitive decision, and I could stand corrected about that, but I did not hear. I heard that the LSDMC for Taft recommended a Montessori, and I think that's great, but we did not decide that there would be a Montessori there. Nor did we decide to displace those students to go wherever they wanted to go. So that's what I would ask.
May I, or is it me or no?
Did you want to have another question?
No, I was gonna say, I believe what we actually then voted on though was that they would start the process of Taft Montessori, starting with the kindergarten group coming through, or first grade or wherever it starts at, but that the students who are there presently would be able to stay as they were. I think now with regard to what Montessori will end up looking like or how it'll develop, whatever, was a little bit different. And then at that time, we also decided that the wrap would stay at Taft Elementary as the original proposal was. So while there was discussion about where students could or might go, or whether we wanted to think about potentially, I think one of the things we did talk about is potentially grandfathering and some transportation needs for at least a year to give at least a transition period of time, but that those things would be more of discussion after the fact, but that the at least thing that we passed was adding the wrap, removing the magnet status for the STEM program, and then putting potentially the start of a new Montessori, because in part the original conversation was around the students would leave so they would start a whole new school at the beginning of the process. And so we said those students should be able to stay was the discussion. And then it ended on allow them to say transition some new folks in through the lower level so we wouldn't bring new grades in behind them. And that's what we voted on, was my understanding of what we voted on. But the specifics and details of some of the transition and that part of it will all be things that definitely still needs to come to the board and have discussion around and give direction about what's going to happen. But that was my recollection, at least.
I know Superintendent Murphy wanted to say,
Oh,
you wanted to
go ahead.
clarify. Okay, I still have concerns, and that's why I'm still a little confused, because I don't think we decided on where those students would go. I asked a question around from ad hoc years ago. A lot of those students were going to Taft Elementary from the west side. So if we are going to be allowing students to go back and only 60 of them will be going to Rockdale, that means that we're pushing more students back on the west side, increasing those numbers, which have to be redrawn anyway, which are not in the plans to be redrawn. So I asked, where were they going specifically? Because that means some schools on the west side where they're coming from are going to now potentially be overcrowded. And I don't think it's a sufficient enough answer to just say wherever they want to go without us knowing where they have the ability to go to. And so that's why I asked the question. I don't think that we discussed it further. I also know that there's a charter school that shares transportation with Taft Elementary. When I looked at their transportation cost, so they could potentially, I didn't understand how their school is right, literally 100 feet from them. So they're already getting transportation there. So it's not really an additional cost. That building has a large cost, but it's also the charter sharing school transportation with the charter. So I'm a little confused. I just needed a little bit more information, and I don't think we got that information. So for me, but Vice President Bowles.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be any confusion necessarily about a startup of Montessori. I think that even reviewing the meeting itself, that some kind of startup of Montessori, that's not the issue is about the kids being able to remain. And I think on 3 different occasions in the conversation in that meeting, a board member asked, can the kids stay? And I think 3 times the superintendent, I believe, said yes, and particularly if they're interested in Montessori. But I think the question for you that you're asking is, the kids that don't want to stay and continue to be a part of it, even without that transportation. But I think you're right, the transportation's taken care of with the other charter school possibly. Your concern, if I'm understanding, is about the kids that are remaining or not remaining. You're just worried right now about the kids that are currently at Little Taft and what's happening to them, and you need the superintendent to answer that?
So I think I said this back in December. My concern is not just that. Thank you for bringing that up. My concern also stemmed from the engagement of those kids and those families around the change of their school. So it's not enough in my mind to say wherever they want to go. We should know where they qualify to go if they choose to, and what their options are if they choose to stay. And it felt to me like we were worried about a Montessori, but not worried about the kids that were remaining and the engagement of the families that were there. And so also, I didn't feel like or understand if we had with Fidelity inquired between the transportation, we're removing their transportation, but we're going there anyway because the bus is dropping the other kids off right there 100 feet from them. So I just don't, we don't even know where those kids are coming from. It wasn't definitively stated where those kids are coming from, what schools they're going to. We've talked to 10 kids and they qualify here. Like, what are we doing? We're worried about the Montessori piece. We got that down pat. But what about the 200 or almost 200 kids that remain there? That's what I was asking about, and the engagement with those particular families. And we skirted along and we decided on one piece of it, but I didn't feel like we definitively answered any of the existing questions. So that's my I put it on the record, and at least one other board member asked me about Taft Elementary, so it wasn't just me that was confused. But you know, if the board said that we're fine with that, then you guys know my position. So you want to offer something?
All of the students who are at Taft right now, pre-K through 5, will be able to remain at Taft pre-K to 5. I'll back up because it was a lot of business that December meeting. The original plan was that their magnet status would be removed. Therefore, there would be no transportation. That was the only original thing stated. And then we wanted to move the preschoolers from Vine to Taft so that the school would remain and have the wrap at Vine. That was the original piece that was shared with the board.
Yeah.
However, there was no Montessori anything in the original plan for Vine and for Taft. But during that meeting, there was a request that they would be able to stay. Along the way, Rothenberg declined the conversation around Montessori. Not a problem. The Taft LSCMC wrote a letter saying we would like it. That's how that began. But as a board, what I recall is we did not want to force those kids who are currently there to leave. Understand? So what we said was they can stay, be grandfathered, but they would matriculate through. So there's probably about 6 years that those students don't have to worry or be concerned about going to another school. There are current 3-year-old preschoolers who will be able to remain as a 4-year-old preschooler. So the Montessori startup next year will only be preschool, making it a little bit more expensive in my mind, just as a startup. So there's about 7 years of transition for that school community at this point.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
We're aligned.
Okay.
My, my question / concern is that when we say that students can stay, we are taking away their transportation. So can stay sounds like a maybe. If transportation is your issue, you can't stay because we're busing them from the west side. Primarily that population had a huge west side participation. And that we had known that from the data in ad hoc. So if they don't want to stay, or if they want to stay, but transportation is their issue, where would they go? That's why I asked the other question, like, well, okay, they qualify to go to Westwood.
Well, what we can do from a neighborhood standpoint only is we can get that information to you so that you would know where their neighborhood school would be. But past that, what their interest is, I don't know. I have not checked on that at all. But we can by address say to you, this is what the neighborhood assignment would be.
I got you. And that's what led to my question around engagement. Have we talked to those families to find out this is the plan? I know that our plan has evolved as a board.
Yeah.
But since December, have we engaged them to find out this is what's going on? This is how many would stay, this is how many wouldn't stay. That's why I asked those questions back in December around, hey, do we know if the LSDMC is interested in this? I think that's wonderful. But have they done their due diligence around asking their population of families how many would stay, how many wouldn't, how many would need transportation? And it didn't sound like
There was a joint meeting of both schools to discuss this. I can't remember the date. I can pull the date, but there was a joint meeting for both schools, Vine and Taft Elementary.
Okay. No, I mean, it's okay. I'm just saying those were the questions that I asked because I wanted to understand about the population of students that were there. I think it's great. Again, I've expressed my concerns. If the board is fine with not getting that additional information, that it is what it is. But I just felt like we were very concerned with a Montessori, which I think is great, but we were just not as concerned around the students that were remaining, only to the point where we said 60 of them can qualify to go to Rockdale. We were leaving out a significant number of kids that we had no interest. We had no idea what they wanted or how many would remain. And that just troubled me, but I'm fine with that.
I think we didn't spend more time on it because I thought we decided that they would stay in December. So,
but we just don't know how many are going to, or how many need transportation. I just felt like there were still unknowns.
Yes, and the transportation piece again was only because the directive was to remove the magnet status.
That's fine. Board Member Weinberg.
And so, Superintendent, to add to that, are we aware, do we know how many students it would affect? How many? Or can we figure out and find out how many it could possibly affect in terms of deciding if they would like to choose to stay or go to a different school? I think that it's important to have that information to be able to even know anything moving forward.
It's not a hill I'm willing to die on. I just wanted to bring it to our attention. We never revisited it because we spent a significant amount of time talking about Montessori. And so I just wanted to bring that up. But continue, Jen.
All right, so Rob, if we can slip to the slide deck. And you can flip to the, oh, I just want to point out that it got posted or sent out on Thursday and then updated two things on slide 16 and slide 19. So if you have the older version, this is the newest version. Excuse me. So if you'll flip to the next slide. So you wanted the cost of phase one. So the list that Ms. Bolton read, the final cost of all that was 1.3 million. The largest part being staff, because we committed to keeping the staff in place. And so that had an extra little bit of cost there, but so that was the cost of phase one. And what I'll do is whenever they do the other document from the assignment, we'll drop the costs in by bullet point. This is just a collective cost. Next slide is phase two. If you recall on December 2nd presentation, I presented that phase two would have a net savings of $1.4 million if you adopted growth plan in whole. Then we had our board vote, and so that dropped the savings to about $350,000. And that does include SCPA going to one start time still. That's about $1 million in transportation savings. Okay, so and that was from the original staffing that went out on January 9th. And so if there's any appeals during in those areas, that 353 might change a little bit. I don't have all the appeals that costed that or yet. Questions on that phase one or two? Ms. Matt?
My apologies.
Ms. Matt, for Matt.
Yes, just my quick question is, so I recognize that we have identified the net savings, but have the team been able to identify, I guess, what the actual cost is for phase two?
Yes, it's in the document. I don't think I have it attached. I can send it out again, but it's in the document that was presented on December 2nd. It shows you all the costs and then all the different savings. But that's just the net value. I didn't know that you wanted to go through all those details this morning. So I can write myself a note so I won't forget.
Okay.
I'll resend it out.
Okay, thank you. That is, I think, at least for me, keep it at the top of my mind
Yeah.
to know what the actual cost is and to be able to identify this is how much we're saving.
Sure.
To the point that you made, all in kind of one place. So thank you.
So it's a grid that shows you like so-and-so's point A going to point B, and then if they have equipment costs, if they have moving costs, if they have staffing costs, and then it's just spread out. And so, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so next slide, phase three.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Vice President?
Thanks. When you go back here to the phase one, the staff costs, you mentioned that's because we maintain staff.
Yeah, particularly when they combined Riverview and Mount Washington, the formulas would have driven a surplus, but we, as a commitment to the staff and to the change and to the parents, we committed to keeping the staff in those areas.
So it was in the implementation and doing it in a greater humanity, if you will, timing, since we were doing all that very quickly. It was that we were in that transition. We kept staff. It isn't that we added staff. It's that we kept staff perhaps where they were or were not needed in order to maintain some aspect of programming at Riverview. Or
We may have added a AP or a security or something in the mix, but
okay.
it wasn't something significant. I don't remember exactly, do you? Okay, so it wasn't an add, it was just a net move, but I mean, when I send out those documents, I can send out the
That'd be
the
great.
details of that too.
I don't mean to belabor it. I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Move on. Okay, phase three. So I just added, at your leisure, if you want to go look, I added the presentations I did on December 9th and the 18th when I was explaining the COPS presentation. So this is going to drive into the whole levy planning conversation. You have, if you hit the next slide for me, I think it's
Mhm.
you have four big needs. One, you have the $48 million renewal that's coming up in November of 2025. And so there's some decisions to be made about that, whether you want to continue as a 5-year cycle, go to a 10-year cycle, go to continuing, or do a substitute. And if you want to keep it the same size. Because this is the one that supports the $15 million set aside for preschool expansion. So there's a decision to be made there. And then you have operational needs. So as you recall, the growth plan had savings in the first year, but then there were some career tech ads that were going to be added to the budget in the following years. You also have entering negotiations. So if there's any negotiated increases that come through that, that all has to be sized, but you do have a need for more new money just to operate. Then you have the facility repair plan that I think that at last costing was 170 million over a 5-year period. And I costed that if we did a PI levy, it would be approximately 4 mils. And you could do that in 26 or 27 because you have one on 25 already. You could do 2 in 1 year, but then you risk having one go up and one go down. And so it's a risk to take. And then the other fourth need is to support the growth plan on phase 3, which is the 7 projects that cost about 200 million on construction. There's no programming in there, just the construction costs. And you could do a bond levy close to when the current bond levy expires. And so we're having some strategic talks that we have some creative things to do. You can go a little bit early, or you could actually borrow against future tax revenues. So I'm setting up a meeting with our financial advisor, David Conley, Kent Cashel, and Brenda Weimer. We're all going to get in the room together and work through the details because they're very complicated. And then we'll come to the board and talk about that one. So 1 mil right now is generating about $8.8 million in property revenue. You want to go with a fixed sum levy, because if you go back to a fixed rate levy, because we're under the 20 mil floor, it'll pop you back over the 20 mil floor. So you end up like if you had a levy that was generating $10 million and you pop back over the 20 mil floor, you're going to lose what you were gaining under the 20 mil floor. So you only get like 5 million a year instead of 10 million. Does that make sense? I'm making up numbers just to, so the renewal levy or the new operating levy should stay at fixed sum because it'll have a negative impact on the 20 mil floor. Questions? Ms. Bolton?
Vice President Bolton.
This is my favorite part of all of this. And it's also what the President Moffat said we should spend some time on, particularly of all the financial listing here. Help me out. We have our $48 million one coming up. And
can you flip to the next slide? It shows this.
and there's our slinky diagram.
Yeah.
We've got that, and we have issues about the length of it and possibly adding to it in money as well.
Yes.
If we don't add to it money, we really are looking at 26 because you're suggesting we will need new money as early as 26. Is that
You
your?
need new money now, because
I always need new money.
To balance to next year's revenue, you're gonna have to have a budget reduction. And we
Okay.
talked about that.
So help me out. That we're going to need new money. We need it now, and we could add to the 48 million, which is the you don't let me ever call it preschool,
It's not.
but the 48 million, or we could have our own new levy in 26. But regardless of needing that new money and doing something either in one of those two blocks,
You could let the $48 million one expire and create a new levy that's larger.
that's what I wanted to add.
Yes.
So that's yes.
Yes, you could do that.
And if you let it expire, when does it expire and what happens? What's that bridge time between?
So because taxes, this one it would expire, you would quit collecting in your last payment would be like the August of 26 would be the last property tax collection. Because it would expire that calendar year.
Okay.
Because on this particular levy, we had typically when you do a levy in November, you
Mhm.
don't actually start collecting until January of the year plus. So in this levy, we did it in November of 16. we started collecting in January 17 because we put in the ballot language for immediate collection.
Right.
Typically, in normal levies, you do it in November of 16, you don't actually start collecting until January of 18, because property taxes are a year in arrears. So that's why this levy, when it expires in 25, you'll quit collecting on it in 26.
So in this levy, we could, as a messaging thing or as an optional thing, you could let this expire and you would create a new levy, not an old renewal, but
Correct.
a new levy. And that new levy be this, would we encompass and take care of our preschool situation and our other operational money at 33 and add what we need for the facilities? Or is that what you're talking about? A new?
No, I wasn't, no, because it would be, the millage would be huge if you
Okay.
add the facility repair plan into that. So we would have to cost out what the new need is, and there's too many unknowns right now for me to come out with $1.
Okay.
Okay, so, my recommendation would be to stick to an operational levy and a PI levy in the following year, but don't do them in the same year. But and I wouldn't do them together because it would be, the millage would be so high that I don't think it would pass.
Right. So that's where I have, where I need more clarity is right there at the front end of this. I don't have a problem with the back end of this to finish phase 3 or whatever, which all those additions. And I see that as the big additions, but I know Mr. Craig has been pretty adamant about first things first regarding the facilities piece. So probably this is an introduction or a third or fourth introduction to this topic. We can move on today, but that's where I would need some more understanding as to the sequence, the chain of events for this new money. Because you're right, we need new money now. We've gone even past our 8-year efforts, the last couple of, I don't know, 16 or 20 some years of doing this every 8 years. But that's, if we can come back, maybe that happens in finance or whatever, and we get even down and dirty on that a little bit more, would be helpful to me. I don't know if other members have questions, I think, to ask.
As a matter of fact, it looks like Board Member Craig does.
So I'll try and be quick because I want to get through as much of this as we can get through today. I do think so. I think we're actually tasked with 2 questions that we need to immediately think about as a board. One is the operational levy. What is both the dollar amount, length of time that we want to request? I think it's a pretty simple for that part. If we choose not to do it, then we have to make decisions based on the hope that we would sometime, someone would pass a new levy if we don't choose this one. And I don't think that's necessarily the wisest course of action to do. I think the second thing that we have to decide at a near future, so not as immediate, but pretty soon after, is that we 2 years ago, I think almost, or a year and a half ago, were given a fact finding on what are the facility repair needs. Those have not gotten cheaper. They will only get more expensive the more we go, the more we wait. And the reality, though, is that we're at a point where we're not going to be able to, we would not be successful putting 2 levies on the ballot at the same time. Even saying to folks, you don't want your building to fall apart in the middle of a snowstorm, right? Like as dire as that may sound to folks, they're going to look at 2 levies and say, well, but which one do you need most, and make us pick. So I think it makes more sense to do 25, we do the operational levy, 26 is when we come back to do a PI levy to draw revenue. And now the question becomes, how do we want to phase in those facility needs in accordance with also what are the district needs for those facilities? Because I think there's a reality, there's some repairs that may definitely need to get done, that the reality is we're just not going to get them done in the same time frame, right? Like you're not going to do every roof in the district at one time. And I think that's where we had the fact finding before. They gave us a plan of things, and I think that's where we can get that plan, and as over the year goes, make a decision to really put that as a forefront. I think the reality of that also means that we can do a lot of the work with trying to make sure all our buildings are updated and ready for every student who walks in the door. That's the other part to the struggles that we're going to see from the state, is they don't seem to share a love of interest for giving more funding to districts to do facility work in the way that once was done. So I think that's for us, at least right now, the immediate question and immediate thing that I appreciate Jen for bringing back to our forefront is what is that a dollar amount? In a large part because it also will drive some of our discussion as to what ultimately is our budget for the next school year. Because if we are prioritizing certain things, that will mean that we may not have the same amount of revenue to drive to other stuff. Or we may be looking at other needs that we have to figure out a way to compensate or pay for, whether it's the next fiscal year or the fiscal year after, through these levies.
Just shared with you, a Google sheet that's called Forecast Long Term. So one thing I forgot to mention on this slide here is you have November 25 is the renewal. You have another renewal of 28, which is a $65 million levy. Then your next renewal after that's 32. So you have 25, 26, 27. 26 is when we're doing the triennial update. So 28 would be a bad time to have a new money on the levy. So this is where I'm tracking cash forecasts and trying to maintain a positive cash balance with what we know to be new upcoming in cyclical needs. So if you scroll down a little bit where it says operational cash, right there. So what I'm trying to do is look at what is the size levy going to look like. So I know what the growth plan, or we thought what the growth plan was going to cost going forward. We know what the facility repair plan, based on Chris's excellent planning work. I just threw 200 million in as a growth plan for 3 in 28 because I didn't know when it was going to happen. And then technology, they're on a 5-year cycle, so they're going to have needs going forward. But we know that right now that $6.5 million worth of leases we paid for ESSER this year, coming back to the general fund in 26. So that's going to be an increase to the budget. And then I got a 5-year curriculum cycle adoption from the curriculum department, and I dropped those in because that's above and beyond our current operational spending. So I'm trying to do those knowns. And then once we start looking at cost increase, COLAs, any kind of negotiated changes that might cost money in the CBAs, and any other things that might come up as part of new growth plan stuff or new strategic plan stuff. So I'm trying to keep track of this on a document so that once I get the dollar amount, I can calculate the millage to figure out and help decide what direction to go in. But you have windows of time in order to do this new stuff. You flip back. Thank
I have
you.
a question for you before we get off that slide.
Oh, all right, stay there. Sorry.
When it says millage calculation under 28, fiscal year 28, that's not 28 mil, is it?
It only because the $200 million is in it. So if you pull that up, because that's not gonna be part of the new money levy, it'll be a
Okay.
bond issue.
Okay.
200 million.
I thought that, it just was kind of like that excuse a lot.
$200 million would be, it's not a 22 mil. You don't take 200 million divided by 8.8 mil, for mils, because what you're paying annually is the principal and interest on the borrowing, right? So if you borrow 200 million, you'd only have to be, I think I calculated it to be about 3 mils, to do a $200 million bond levy.
Okay, thank you. Any other Vice President Bolton?
You go ahead.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I want to make sure I'm tracking with you, Treasurer Wagner. So with the 48 mil renewal, we know that that money was already voted upon by the taxpayers, and this is something that we're possibly considering to renew for this upcoming levy cycle. But as you talked about, if we decided to allow those funds or that renewal opportunity to expire, you talked about the opportunity to create new money. What would that particular levy be considered with the new money being generated after you identify what all the needs are?
Well, we haven't finished identifying all the needs yet.
Right,
That's the
right.
conversation here. But yeah,
Mm.
once that's done, you can cost it out and figure out what the new levy would be that
Uh,
would replace the old levy.
Okay, so it's pretty much at our discretion as to whether we decide for it to be a PI levy or what's the other operational levy?
It's called an emergency levy. I don't
Oh,
know why
okay.
they call it an emergency, but that's what it's called, fixed sum levy. A permanent improvement levy, you can only do permanent improvement projects on it that have a 5-year lease life or older. You can't use a PI levy for operations.
Okay,
Okay, you can use an operational levy for improvements, but you can't go the other way.
okay,
And the same thing with bonds. The bonds can only be on construction.
okay. But again, it's at our determination as to what
Right.
levy we decide we would
Right.
want to put on the
Right.
ballot. Okay.
So we did this exercise one time when I was the baby treasurer. I don't know if Miss Bolton was there or not, but we put all the wishes up on the list and we costed it out and it ended up being like 30 mils and it was dead silence. Everybody walked out depressed. I'm like, well, that's your wish list. Now let's figure out what reality is. And reality is really about the millage number, about what we think we can pass rather
That's
than what
it.
the dollar value is.
Okay.
8 has a magic number, I'm told, in the election world. So,
Does.
yep. No, yeah, they try to stay under double digits, so stay making a 9.98 levy.
Done.
So
Vice President Bolton.
Yeah, very quickly. So we have a renewal that we have to make some decisions about in 25. We have, what's the next renewal that we have? 28?
8, and that's the $65
That's
million.
the 65 one.
Yep.
And then the next renewal that we would or could have would be based upon how long we make the 48 one, or
No,
what's
it's the
next one?
32, it's $52 million levy. It comes up in 32.
Would be the next in 32. So we know we have 25, 28, and 32.
Right.
We also know that our giant facilities master plan, it will be paid off in that, I know that's not the right term, in 30 something.
December 1st of 31.
So the huge thing I'm just talking about messaging and monies and whatever. We have almost a greater opportunity for money a little bit later, but our problem right now is that we need money now.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And if you, in the $48 million levy, I can't express this enough. The $15 million set aside for preschool, both entities have outgrown that, right?
Right.
This year's budget's about $20 million. We're using prior year unspent cash to fund that, but that unspent cash is gonna run out next year. So with next year's budget, we're either gonna have to take money away from K-12 to help fund the growth in preschool or scale back what we're doing in preschool
Right.
for both entities. So, or you increase the revenue, right? So decisions.
Any other
Okay.
questions? Okay.
Okay, the next slide is just another look at the timeline. I won't go through it, but it just, there you go. It just kind of shows you, like, I put on there, like, what other things are happening, like next summer, next November, we have 4 members are coming up for election. And then we put the city council election up there. And so, you could just look at that at your leisure. Okay, next slide. In the interest of time. So somebody asked to have the debt summary, to review the debt summary schedule. This is what it looks like. We actually paid off one borrowing in December 1st of 24. We made our last payment. You can see that is the second gray line. The one up above it will make our last payment in June coming up. And so we'll have paid off those 2 debts. The top line is the only voted levy that we have. That's the bond levy. We, as of July 1 of 25, we'll have $173 million balance. And then the other ones were used to help fund the rest of the facility master plan. So we just keep plugging away. The 2011, 2012 Q Scoobies, we actually making principal and interest payments into what they call it a sinking fund. It's really kind of like a set aside. So all our principal and interest payments are going into that so that when the loan comes due, that money's already there to pay it off. That's what that is. So you can see that on the 2011, we owe $3 million, but we have 2.7 set aside in a sinking fund. So we only have $220,000 left on July. Okay. Any questions on debt? And
Good or
before you
bad?
ask me, we only have about $9 million of debt capacity, which isn't going to help us much in our future planning.
That's right.
So the answer is not to get more debt. Okay, next slide. Oh my gosh. Okay, so these are the topics that we wanted to discuss during this section. Just go ahead and flip to the next slide. Zero-based budgeting versus incremental. I was asked to explain that. Incremental budgeting, you just take what you have and you keep adding to it as you do strategic new things that you want to buy. Zero-based budgeting, you start off at zero and then you evaluate everything you spend your money on for the effectiveness of that spend. So what happens is in incremental budgeting, the budget grows so fast because you never stop doing anything you did, right? And so we really like to go back to zero-based budgeting. It's really hard. It's hard work because nobody ever wants to stop doing things. But we just don't have the cash reserves to continue with incremental budgeting.
I just want to point out, we are currently at incremental.
We tried over the years to go back to zero-based, but not everybody cooperated, let's put it that way.
Gotcha. Vice President Bolton.
So I heard you say we want to go back to zero base.
Treasurer Wagner wants to go back to
Okay.
zero-based.
On our way out. But yes, I think we all are interested in zero base.
So we all know, and we presented this before, our revenues are not keeping track with inflationary rates. So our budgets keep getting squeezed down further and further. And because, and this is not a criticism, Ms. Sellers, but because we do school budgets first, whenever there's a reduction, it hits in central office. We call it residual budgeting. We'll go over that in just a second. Okay, next slide.
Fingers crossed.
I was asked to explain student-based versus staff-based. We used to do student-based budgeting, I don't know, early 2000s, mid 2000s. And there were some inherent weaknesses in that model. One was dealing with student mobility, because what they do is the money follows the students. And we did enrollment 3 times capture enrollment 3 times in a year. And the schools that start high and lose kids would lose revenues, but they kept the staff. And so at the end of the year, they would be owing the district back money. And that just kept building. And so we kind of abandoned that. The other concern is with student-based budgeting, we would take all the students and do their weightings. And then we would give the school, I'll just say Wagner Elementary, here's your $15 million, go build a budget. Well, they weren't always compliant with the things they really needed. They kind of funded what they wanted. Like, for example, we had one school who saved a teaching team, great academic instruction, but they didn't budget for any security. So when it came to baseball season, they're calling me asking for more money for security. I'm like, well, that's the decision you should have made when you built your budget, right? So, and then there wasn't always the tracking on the compliance, special needs compliance stuff. And now, because we have restricted funding in the state formula, so all our weighted, our gifted, ELO, career tech, and poverty are all restricted funds. You have to show that you're spending that money on those things. To get that down at the school level granularly is a little bit difficult. It can be done. We have the systems to do it. We take a lot of teaching and guidance. But so that's student-based. So the money is actually allocated to the schools based on the needs of the students. And those are considered the needs of the students. Staff base is kind of the way we're doing it now, because we do the student projections, but we calculate the staff, and then everything gets driven off of, not everything, a lot of those things get driven off, and then the school gets a per pupil allocation for non-personnel, and they decide how to spend that money. Any questions?
I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Excuse me. Vice President Bolton.
Help me and everybody, because some people actually think because we do our budgeting by enrollment, we do our staffing by enrollment, that there's some element that's student based. In reality, it's not. To explain a little, just quickly, a little bit more, that there's money that exists, there's revenue that exists, restricted revenue, based upon what kinds and types of kids or cohorts we have. Help me out real quick.
So it is student-based. So it's all based on the students in the district. So
Yeah,
it is
but it's
student-based, but it's not really student-based budgeting.
Right, it's not.
So it's student-based staffing. So you take the projected number of students and you roll through the formulas, and then you decide how many kindergarten teachers, how many first grade. And then on the conditions of the kids, there's a team of each department determines what staffing is needed for, like, the special needs kids based on their IEPs. And then there's other formulas that grow, like regardless of what the needs of the population of a school is, you're gonna get an assistant principal for every 100 or 450 kids, or it takes 450 kids to get an assistant principal. But it could be, if you looked at, the discipline of the building, you might decide, well, we need a little bit more of something rather than just equally using the same formula across the board. So it's the way you measure and track and weight the conditions of the students or the needs of the students versus a flat formula that's equal across the board. Did that answer your question?
I think so. It's just the students do determine what kinds of money is in that each school's budget.
Correct.
It's not just the overall number of enrolled, but it's what sorts of kids you have, because some kids are producing more revenue, if you restricted revenue, than maybe general ed kids would produce. I mean, this is coming from the state, the feds, where?
So it depends. Sometimes it's our policy, sometimes it's collective bargaining agreement, sometimes it's a state or federal rule law. So we have to follow all of them. So right now, when you're gonna staff in elementary school, we go through our formulas. They're mostly collective bargaining agreement designed. And then the different teams, DSS will go and say, okay, with this population of kids, you need this many intervention specialists, or this many classroom specialized units, or this many one-on-one paras based on IEPs. And then the gifted team will say, okay, based on these kids, you need this many gifted teachers. ELL will say you need this many ELL teachers. Instead of on this side, it's all driven by the weighting and the funding of the students for them to look at the school's needs to come up with a plan.
Based on the type of kids you have.
The needs of the
and
kids.
number.
So it depends. I mean, we talked at one point of using the size of the building or students experiencing homelessness. Discipline. We looked at reading scores, and we played with a lot of data to determine like how best to fund the needs of each individual school so that it was more equitable rather than equal.
Thank you.
Questions?
I do want you to. I want you to. I want you to go through this, but I do feel like there's some benefit to having the uniqueness of each building have what they need, and there should be a way to drive the formula down to say, hey, these are the things you have to fund. You have to fund security. You have to fund, so, but after all of those needs are met,
Right.
then you get to be as creative as you want to. And I think that I don't know if it was a decade ago and maybe times are changed and we can do things differently, but
I'm doing some modeling with different types of schools just to see like if I can come up with one model that all schools can fit into, but each of their needs get taken care of. So I'm at the beginning. I've only done one school and it was an interesting exercise, but so we'll come back when we have more data and we can talk about.
Fine. Well, it's on you.
All right, next slide. Residual budgeting. I think I talked about this, but I just did a little graphic. So, residual budgeting is you take a budget target. So we have $624 million to play with.
Again.
We do the school budgets and then central office gets what's left over. And then if they have money left over, they get to do some new strategic initiatives. Right. So it's kind of like what's left over. On the other side, you set your budget target, you fund your strategic initiative first, because that's what's going to take the district forward. And then you go zero based on the rest and figure out what's the most effective spend to get to where you want to go. Because we can't cut any more central office. We're cutting to the level of incompetence and not incompetence, in the ability to serve the schools the way they need to be served. So they just can't keep taking it on the chin. I knew they grew for a while and we got rid of some of that growth, but it's hurting us.
Real quick on that. I know this will sound terrible, but I don't know that funding the schools or budgeting the schools first is necessarily the wisest thing, but I think we do it first in part because of
transfer rounds.
I mean, it's the tail wagging the dog. And then we have to make adjustments. I mean, obviously our schools and our kids are our number one priority, but But having to have the school budgets done as early as they have to be done because of the staffing, I think rushes us into some decisions that maybe we wouldn't necessarily make.
So I think I may have misspoken. It wasn't necessarily the transfer rounds that caused us to go earlier. We went earlier because we were trying to compete with other districts for the best
The
teachers.
recruitment,
Right. So that's why we moved it up, was because of the ability to recruit. And
That was
so
it.
I'm not sure how to make both of those things happen, but we'll work
Okay.
on it.
thank you,
Okay, next slide.
Mr. Craig.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say one of the things though, and looking at the two different strategies, I think actually what makes the priority that we tried to set last year and that we still didn't really get to, but if you don't establish your priorities well before you start to go into your budget talks, which we didn't do again this year, you can't have the second model where you're talking about your strategic initiatives and your investments that are necessary, because you're still doing the conversation around we don't even know what we want yet. And I think that's why, in large part, why still some of the budgeting stuff we're doing when we go to the school budget and central operations, all that, yes, part of it is yes, trying to deal with getting recruitment and everything else. But if you look at a lot of organizations, when they have budgets that start when ours technically start, they do their conversations in the spring of that fiscal year before. So like not the spring, like we're not talking about fiscal year this year, talking about school year in the fall. We're talking about spring this year to talk about the school year for next fall. And when you do that, that gives you so much more time to have the true conversation around what your budget priorities are, to then also evaluate what happened throughout the year to see whether or not those priorities still last. So like, I think one of the things that might be helpful for us to do as if we are able to power through a lot of what we're doing now, is to not end the conversation around the budget, to really just try and get us to get in this point of doing, okay, so for next year, what are our budget priorities that we want to establish up front? And especially when we're having a new treasurer come in because Jen refuses to stay with us for forever, and with us having certain things we've already established are changes to the district, if we set some of those priorities early and upfront, as we keep trying to drive to do, then when we get to this point next year, it's not about building these things. It's about, okay, we now know what we have. We've seen what worked. We've seen what our budget looks like. And we're able to give a clearer picture to the teachers. We're able to give a clearer picture to the other staff in our schools, but to parents and to students and to ourselves. Because I think that's what our struggle has been, is that we wait to do our priority until the fall. And now we're also doing all this other stuff also. And so it hasn't really given us an opportunity to do true budgeting the way organizations who live in the level of organization and forethought have.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next slide. So I was asked to share our current staffing model formulas that we've been talking about. So for example, a K3 classroom right now, we load to 25 with a para. And I talked about the assistant principal formula. That's not in the CBA. It's just our common practice. So that's an example of formula that's not dictated by state law. But it would be insane not to have APs in our buildings. Counselors and social workers were trying to get to national averages. And in fact, last year when we added the counselors for graduation, we're actually better than the national average. Social work, I've been doing some investigating on that. I think the recommendation is 1 for 120, and I'm like, there's no way. Right now we have 1 per building, which is something to think about, because you have 1 building with 700 kids in it, 1 building with 300 kids in it. Do they both need 1 full-time social worker? But it could be because of the conditions of the kids and what their needs are. I don't know. So it's just things to look at. And then Mike actually did this slide deck for us, or this slide. And he actually linked the full staffing formulas if you want to get into the granularity, but that's what's currently that's what funded the January 9th staffing. There's a new model that we're looking at right now that has smaller class sizes in K3 and 4-6 and 7-8. Right? All 3 of those grade bands. Yeah. Okay. So the next slide.
I had a question, Jen.
Yes.
You said that previously, a lot of what we do is driven by the contracts. So these numbers are for the classroom-based formulas. Those are driven by the contract.
Yeah. So all that's except for, so there's different contracts, right? So in the CFT contract, the class sizes are in there. The ELO for staffing formulas are in there, and special needs and psychology, some of the other stuff's in there too, right, Julie? Oh. Okay. Then in the CAS contract, I don't think we have any staffing requirements in there. So, but the state says you have to have a principal in every building. So that's a state rule. The assistant principal is our rule. And then the secretarial ones are some of it's defined in their CBA. You have to have a building engineer by state law in every building. So it's a collective sources of them. Okay, thank you. You're welcome. Next slide. There we go. So I was asked to talk about TAC and overload. So currently the student projections by school by grade and conditions drive class size formulas. That drives into school staffing. Then that drives into transfer rounds. So you have people that positions that move around. Okay. Then in September, after Labor Day, there was always this thought that some kids didn't show up until after Labor Day. So they gave time to get all the kids in the buildings before we would right size the staffing to actual students. Because it's all projected and projections are projections. And so that's always done in September, but there's an interest in moving that forward, so it's less disruptive to the academic instruction, right? So, I still, even if we move it up in August, I still think there's gonna have to be a September adjustment. It might be smaller, but if there's a group of kids that don't show up, then you gotta have staff in places that you don't need them and you'll be overstaffed. I'm sorry, I keep hitting this. But then I also put the fiscal year 25 overload budgets up there. So currently we have in the current year budget, $4.7 million funded for overload paras. And Emily would tell us that we don't have overload paras, they're just paras, but in order for us to do staffing the way we do staffing, we have to label them as the role that they're playing in the school. And then in addition to overload para, we have overload pay budget. That's another $2.1 million. So some of the formulas say when you get into an overload situation, you get overload pay. And then when you get to the next level, you get a para. And then you get to the next level, you take that stuff away and put a new teacher in. So you split the class in two. Any questions on that? Non-operational. Yes, thank you. Okay, next slide. So I think Ms. Bolton asked me this question, are formulas a help or a burden? And we try to go through kind of pros and cons. Formulas gives you a mean to allocate money, right? And it can be student-based, and hopefully it will be. It provides a level of equality. You know, I keep saying everybody wants equity until it's not equal, then they want equal. I get phone calls all the time. It can be very transparent if you publish all your formulas and your data. And then formulas also, you have to have formulas in order to allocate your Title I monies. So it has to be based on something. The burden side is currently right now, it's kind of staff based, and that makes it a little bit harder. It's a little bit inflexible sometimes, like the social worker, formula. Potential for inequities, because when you're doing things equally, they become sometimes inequitable. And then it's slower to adapt to student changes. So if there's a shift in enrollment or a shift in the decline in enrollment, stuff like that. So formulas are both a help and a burden, not an or. Okay, questions? Next slide.
I'm sorry, some formulas we could change and would not require contractual language changing.
Well, yeah, like we changed the assistant principal formula. this year.
Exactly.
It changed every year for the last 3 or 4 years.
So it'd be really, it's good.
Mhm.
We don't need to know it, but you all know which ones that are written in stone and which ones aren't. And which ones, if you're in the midst of negotiations or something, or you can
Right.
get some kind of change. Okay.
Yep. Okay, so next slide. This could segue to the next slide. So under the traditional formulas that I showed earlier, we had a general fund budget of 397 million on January 9th for just staffing, school staffing. Then we ran it with smaller class sizes at the request of the superintendent. So K3 went to 20-1, 4-6 went to 28, and 7-12 went to 30. Without paras. And it showed that would increase our staffing by close to $5 million. Smaller class sizes means more people. And you need more people than your had paras that are going away. So, any questions on that?
Kareem?
I'm sorry.
Uh,
I kind of want, yes, to your
let's
question,
linger
but,
here.
but I also want to ask the board members because it is
Please.
1:56.
Please do.
And I would ask if, can we get just a little bit extra time? I know some people had a hard stop, but can we get just a little bit of extra time from everybody? Okay.
We can add the rest of it to the next board meeting. if you want,
Yeah,
but-
okay, so just to get through this, through Jen's part, I think, the budgeting piece at least.
Yeah, there's,
Okay.
there's a couple good stopping places real quick.
Okay. Vice President Bolton.
There, so this, you're saying that with running at the lower number of students, lower class size, that you did, it's a $5 million difference. Is that taken to place not needing paras or not needing overload? So this means overload. You'd still have the same amount of overload, or you're still, help me out.
No, the overload goes away because you're making small.
That's what I'm
class sizes.
asking. So this
but-
5 million, you already took away any savings because we wouldn't have overload.
Right, that's a net change,
Okay, but overload and paras
are gone.
are part of the, are this, and it's still 5 million
Yes,
more,
yes.
but with smaller classes, and it's smaller classes K-12. That's a $5 million to me, in smaller classes K-12 is looking pretty good.
But you got to figure out what you're going to cut to pay for. 'cause remember, we have a
Absolutely.
finite budget.
Listen, I have a red pen.
Um.
Just
So,
ask me.
so operationally, less pairs in the building means less help with lunch duty, bus duty.
Got it.
And so that will be a concern. Then the schools are going to say, I need my pairs back. And then that budget goes up because they're not going to trade in a teacher to do that, right? So,
Board member Craig has a
I
question.
just want to reiterate a point that we made last year when we had this discussion. Have we ever been fully staffed for the level of teachers that we have needed now? So
No.
the thought that we would get to a point where we would be able to staff all of these folks is also somewhat not realistic unless we've made that great of an effort to get even to the level we need now. So I do think, like, while I'm all for, if we want to make this decision, we can make the decision, whatever. But also with the reality that we're still going to have classes that are bigger than that because, or spaces where we're going to need pairs and other things to fill those spaces because we don't have that now. So, I mean, we budget for not filling positions each year. So, like, I want us to be kind of more honest about that conversation if we're going to talk about smaller class sizes.
Also budgeting for overload too. We're budgeting to be at max. My concern is I'm not sure in the marketplace how having smaller classes, would that attract more people? Would that retain more people? Would that save more mental health, let alone the other kinds of things, the stresses for teachers? There's like big things to talk about.
Which is all fine. Again, we don't fill the positions we have, and it's not just us. It's every school district across the country is struggling to find teachers. Now, there's a varying reason why, because we put a lot of burden on teachers. We do not necessarily always support the teachers in the way they need to be supported. But that, until I would find it very hard to say simply making smaller class sizes is going to mean we're going to suddenly get a bunch of teachers. So that's all I'm saying.
I totally agree with that. And same as just making different wages doesn't necessarily do it either. People really stay in a building because they like the principal or they don't like the principal, very frankly. So I mean, there's a half dozen things that could make us be able to fill more positions with the highest quality folks, but
Board member Mapp.
something to think about.
Yeah, so I just have a question as we're talking about the pairs. How often do the, I guess, pairs maybe substitute for maybe the actual gen ed teacher, or are we only focusing on like substitute teachers coming in? Because if we're talking about maybe reducing the amount of pairs, I wonder what that impact would be.
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I don't know, superintendent.
That not having the paras in the buildings will definitely have an impact to the overall operations of the building, including they do have an opportunity to earn a few more dollars on the hour when they cover classes if they're willing to do that. So there could be an impact in the classroom as well.
Okay.
Now,
So,
how many exactly that is?
right, you're right. Okay. But I guess obviously just looking at it, it could be an impact either way, right? If we're looking at the smaller class sizes, that might be a benefit in terms of the learning, but on the other side of things, it could be a huge impact in terms of the operations of supporting our teachers and our students. So it's definitely worth considering when we're having the conversation about changing the staffing formula.
Okay, Board Member Weinberg.
And to add, we could, sorry about that. We could go back and forth regarding class sizes. I mean, there's pros and cons. There's data to show different things. It's obviously worth the discussion, but I think in terms of moving on, it's just realizing that this is the data that it's showing, and then we can have a discussion about it, I guess, later.
I am all for the the proposal and the information. I do think that there are many other things that go into this that I'm interested in knowing about. As far as like what's the vacancy percentage of our pairs currently. We are to Board Member Craig's point, we're at a deficit of teachers and pairs. And so I would like to look at, I think it makes sense I think it's a great savings, and $5 million is for lower class sizes on the surface. Sounds great. But there's also a lot to that number, and I'm not, it's not missed on me that that there are other factors. We're already underpaying our pairs. We're already not paying them when they're not in the building. And I think that when there's a push, there's an opposite pull, and we don't see it right here because it looks great, but there's going to be some negative impact. I know, for instance, Montessori classrooms have a para requirement to them that we're not discussing here. So again, I think it sounds great on the surface. I do want us to kind of get through the slides so that we get the picture in totality, and then we can maybe at a board meeting disaggregate some of this information.
Sure. Okay, so if you'll skip ahead to slide 18. Next, there. This is just a reminder of the language in the resolution that you adopted, that you would not create a budget that exceeds our revenues.
All of our revenues.
Right, all the revenues, but particularly the general fund, since it's the largest share.
I understand, but
Okay.
we did get it to say all of our revenues the last time we passed it.
Yes. Okay, so if you click on the target word, it'll take you to. So this is a work in progress. It changes constantly, and I can't read that, so I'm gonna have to go to my list. But it it starts off with the November forecast so in November of 24, we do it a 5-year forecast. The revenue for fiscal year 26 forecasted was 625 million. Okay. In Finance Committee, we're talking about creating a cash balance policy to build up our cash reserves, because we've chunked into them pretty low. To get to 60-day cash balance over a 5-year phase-in period, you'd have to set aside $12 million every year to start building that cash back up. And so there's no decisions been made, but this is what if we did that, the available money that we have to build a budget on would drop to 612. You follow me? Okay. So from the 612, you take off all the fixed costs. So the fixed costs are defined by our debt payment schedule, the Fund 34 transfer that we're required to do for facility maintenance, all the auditor and state fees, bank fees, liability insurance, and the superintendent's salary and the treasurer's salary, because we're both dictated by state. You have to have one of each. So those don't change. The next line represents what's in the collective bargaining agreement requirements. So like teacher stipend, lead teacher stipends, the sick leave conversion, professional development, long-term subs for maternity and long-term illnesses. Then the step increases. And then crossing guards, we've been saying that if we bring them in-house, it's going to cost us $1 million more in our current budget. The Suzuki returns. So last year we did this $100,000 Suzuki contract from a different source, and that source is gone, so we're bringing that back up. I already talked about the technology return, so one of the lease payments, the $6.5 million we used in ESSER this year, it was coming back to the general fund. Last year, if you recall, we delayed the Rawson repair projects because we knew we weren't going to get it done this year, so we moved it into 26. The school staffing on January 9th was 397 million. You saw that on the other slide. And then with the smaller class sizes, I added that green spot of 4.9. The non-personnel that's being added to the school budgets on a per pupil basis is $6.5 million. And then I have the board discretionary. So it's the board office budget and the internal office budget, internal
priority.
auditor office budget together. So that spend is $481 million already. So that leaves you with $130 million to allocate if you do the $12 million set aside. If you don't do the $12 million set aside, you have $142 million. Comparatively speaking, in the current year budget, that $142 million was about $211 million. So those that haven't been left budgeted are going to have to sacrifice that cut. That makes sense? Got some hard decisions to make. You go back to the slides. You have any questions about this? And I just keep updating as I get new information. So that's why it says it's a work in progress. Don't get any number in your head, because in May, we may have to revise the 5-year forecast based on the current year enrollment trends. And if we lose enrollment, then next year's revenues will decline by the state funding formula. Because remember, property
we have a
taxes don't
growth
change with
plan.
enrollment, but state funding does. Is that
That's why we have a growth plan.
okay? So yeah, you can go back to the slide deck. Thank you. I'll keep talking real fast. We're almost done. I was asked to show, these are our state and federal grants, and so they're listed there. It shows you the fiscal year estimated allocation and then what our estimated carryover is from last year. So how much we have available to spend. So for example, Title I, and this does not include, we took the non-public set aside, so these are CPS dollars. Title I, we have 24 million to spend. We're going to have about $3.5 million in carryover, so our budget will be 27 million for Title I. Okay, next slide shows the rest of them because we split it onto 2 slides. And we shared this at Finance Committee last month, I think. So we have a total of $50 million in allocation in state and federal grants. Some are much more restrictive than others. We have about $5.5 million of carryover for a total of 56.3 million to spend. And the grants team has been meeting with the superintendent. I'm hearing the plans are looking really good. So feeling optimistic about how well we're going to spend that money. Okay, next slide. These are just right off the website. Board goal, your goals, reading, math, and college and career readiness. Next slide shows the guardrails over 2 slides. You can skip over those because they're already public and I'm sure you've read them 100 times. I'm going to turn this over to Superintendent Murphy because these are her identified budget priorities for fiscal year 26.
Thank you, Jen. So in our district performance, sustainability, redesign, and growth plan, I have started to categorize everything that we're doing under growth into either operational efficiencies, which you can see listed number 1, number 2, increased student outcomes, where we value the whole child. And then on the next slide, number 3, preparing our students for beyond the tassel. Those are how I'm categorizing the things that you have voted affirmatively for. Yep, as we move forward. Department of Student Services.
I'm sorry, that's my fault.
No.
We speak in acronyms. We have a whole list of dictionary and acronyms for and as if you flip to the next slide, Rob, you'll see the 3rd category. So you can see what's under them. Was there another question over here? Matt.
Thank you. So, as it pertains to your budget priorities, Superintendent Murphy, you as Treasurer Wagner and the team have been working to identify how each of these priorities work or would fall within our 5-year forecast.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that for most of 1, 2, and 3, Jen shared that out. the cost for the automotive and the cosmetology build out in terms of location would have to be in phase 3 because it'll require a pretty substantial amount of money. We of course believe we can get entrepreneurship done at a very small cost.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, and then my final question to this, based off of those discussions, and setting apart phase 3, Treasurer Wagner, are there any areas that, I think I know your answer to this, but are there any areas that may not look possibly feasible, based off of where we are in our financial reporting at the moment?
I'm not sure I clearly understand your question, but what I can say is we have $625 million and we have a lot of decisions on how we spend that money.
That's what I figured
Yes.
your response was gonna be.
Would it be helpful for me to go through each of those in terms of, in my mind, where I see it falling?
If, do you all want that at a later time? 'Cause I know we are
No.
kind of considering.
I mean,
that.
If
I can do it really quickly.
Okay,
The
okay,
corridor
perfect.
model, there was no cost. Centralized enrollment is repurposing staff. There's a cost to everything, I understand. But in terms of additional cost, nothing. The redesign of our schools, there will be some furniture moves, some toilet moves, over time, a reduction in transportation costs as we move along. Exploring re-centralizing financial operations is something the Treasurer and Wagner and I are talking about right now. The junior high schools, I think Jen gave you the cost out in terms of staffing based on what we know right now. The Montessori Lab School will be a cost in terms of startup, but there is a possible funding source that I'm looking into to help us with that additional expense. The crossing guards, $1 million. The RAP, we do have a couple of grants pending for some very exciting work that we want to do there. The DSS restructure is looking at how we're doing business now and making that more efficient, not asking for an additional cost, hopefully looking for a reduced cost. This Spanish is new to your eyes. As you visit our schools, we have a need to address not only our multi-language learners, in particular Spanish, but even our English children, so that they can begin to even have conversations and create friendships and work with their classmates. It's an ever-growing population. And so looking at that, moving forward. The Public Service Academy, we will do that through our Perkins dollars that we already have. The junior ROT expansion in the Coast Guard, there may be absolutely no cost to the district. I will tell you that the Army Junior ROTC that we have at Aiken costs the district $50,000. And that not only includes the instructor, all of the uniforms these children have to wear and the equipment that we use. There will be a cost to redo the automotive, to create an automotive lab at Woodward, to create a cosmetology lab at Woodward. Entrepreneurship is the cost of a teacher, some books, materials, curricular supplies. The college innovation pathway, we're working with a couple of local colleges and universities to expand on what we already have. I do not see with phase 2 a lot of expense.
Board Member Craig.
I was gonna say two things. One is I appreciate you bringing the priorities as you see them to us, because I think that's helpful, and then I think we owe it to you to give you kind of what our priorities are as well. I think two things on there, at least on the priorities that you've given us, that I would want to make sure that we're thinking about from both this year and longer years. The Montessori Lab is one that, for me, the potential of the cost savings of having to train and educate our Montessori teachers may outweigh the cost of bringing it in. And I think that's a certainly thing for us to talk about, because that gets into one of the things that we're known for being innovative about. But I want to make sure that we kind of solidify that also in that conversation, because if it doesn't end up being very long term or something that can bring revenue in, it may dictate how we look at it and how we utilize it going forward. The other one is one that really is still just a bothersome thing for me, which is our crossing guards. And in part, it's a bothersome thing for me because I think it just more exemplifies why we are having costs that get added to our budget that have nothing to do with what happens inside the school. And it is not fair to us, and it's not fair to call the city our partner if they're not even willing to train or do anything for these crossing guards that are supposed to be providing safety on the streets for our students to get in and out. And I will keep raising it as an issue because I think it is very frustrating that we added $1 million to our budget to cover something that, quite honestly, the safety of the streets is the city's responsibility. It's just like clearing the snow off the ground is the city's responsibility. And I think that's more exemplifies why, to Treasurer Wagner's point, we have to think about our budget because we keep having to do those types of things. We're going to only squeeze out central office staff. If we're having to add everything else in, if we're having to do everything else first, and central office kind of comes in at the last end of it, we're going to end up doing more and more and more stuff with fewer and fewer people to support that work that's being done. The third thing I want to say is I do love the idea of bringing some centralization to the financials. And I know we've talked about this a lot in both budget and finance, but also in the audit committee about how that can also get us to being more efficient with how we deal with some of the building financials and the way things are paid for, looked at, and how dollars are spent. That was a large part of the reason we did the review of all the contracts to see who was doing what, right? And how many buildings had their own separate agreements and that type of things. But I think getting that more consistent will also allow us, there's a couple of policies that we're talking about with regards to age student fees and stuff like that, that we'll get more consistency in how that stuff is done if we have a little bit more centralized unit to that. And I think that will also maybe save us a few dollars in some ways to how we operate those things. So I appreciate you bringing these priorities to us.
Thank you. Okay, Treasurer Wagner, Superintendent.
Yeah, I think next slide. It's your discussion.
This is just a
I'm done.
question, that is just a question for the board, Madam President, to think about, not tonight, but also to think about how we want to engage the community in the budget process. The earlier part of it, but also kind of assessing some of our priorities. So I know that the administration spent a tremendous amount of time in the last budget in multiple presentations to groups. And maybe we ought to look at how they did it then, see if we can do more plenary kind of things. But that's something for the board to figure out as to how to best engage. So that if you can put that on our priority list to talk about down the road, I think that would be important. I would also encourage, as we get ready for these last slides, one we have to have up there big and proud of the slide that
The cow.
the sacred cow.
Yeah, keep going.
Keep
Bob.
going. There you go. Keep going. There you are.
So, yeah, if we're going, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if we're gonna go back to zero-based budgeting and we have to go back to a balanced budget, there's some things that we're gonna have to stop doing.
That's
And
right.
so, once we go through the list of the stop doings, what is it that we're not allowed to stop doing from the board's perspective?
And to the reverse, not the reverse side, but another way of saying that is just as we mentioned before, we were talking about negotiations or whatever. As we look at the budget, what are our specific priorities as individual board members so that we can all talk and see if there's consensus about board priorities as well as the superintendent's priorities. And I would just appreciate that we got through as much as we did today. I think it's great. All of this is not an introduction, but a reminder. And there's some other stuff that is on board docs, particularly about student-based budgeting and zero-based budgeting and whatever. If we could take the time on your own time to look at that, I think it would be helpful. And it'll be up to the board to also keep in mind the history of what we're doing. For example, on board docs, you'll find 2 slides,
Sorry.
and one of them is dated October 14th, 2023, and it's a list of 9 initiatives from the previous superintendent and previous board. And board staff was good enough to reproduce at least the graphic. And what we've done is just update it as we understand it on February 1st, 2025. That's what these particular initiatives from 23 have evolved into. So there's plenty of information on the board docs for people to look and study because administration is deep in the throes of budget already, but the board involvement, is, kind of kicking off.
Do board members have any questions? I think, was that the last slide you all have? Was that-
Yes.
Okay.
Save the best for last.
So I think
Sacred
that
cow.
board members have a lot to do. We will continue to add budget discussions on our agenda for the upcoming board meetings, but I do think there is validity in us understanding where we stand and where we want to go so that we can explain that to the community with fidelity. Additionally, I think when we talk about maybe going back to redoing the budget, maybe we need to also do some internal work ourselves on what our priorities are aside from that, and
Mhm.
just kind of reimagine education. So I invite you to do that as well. Does anyone have any other questions? Superintendent did, with regard to community engagement, my only view around community engagement, that was where I was going to speak, and I want to be very brief. I think that we need to engage the community around our changes, phase 2. I've said that a billion times. You already know that. I'll probably say that from memory. But I think in those discussions, we don't need to necessarily add any additional engagement sessions, but maybe we could add topics to talk about the budget and where we are, in addition to what the changes are. So I think the more we understand that as board members, the more we can join you in engaging the community with fidelity around what's coming in their corridor, what schools are needing to be changed, what that looks like, and then the budgetary impacts of that as well. So if there's no other questions or comments, I think we're done. Our next meeting is February the 10th. Oh, that's right. Do we have any assignments?
Apparently, yes.
Yes, we do. Board Member Weinberg.
Before I go into my assignment, I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of what you said regarding phase 2. I think it's very important as we include the community. So my 3 things will be clarity, making sure that we're just being transparent, and then we're providing the updates on all of the changes. And so as I talk about the assignment, I would like to request getting updates and data regarding the CPS growth plan phase 1 accomplishment sheet that includes cost per bullet point, capacity, service numbers, and any success or challenges.
Did you want to add enrollment to that too?
Say it again.
I thought you wanted to add a enrollment to that?
Yeah, that would be the service numbers, but we can
Oh,
call that
okay.
enrollment. Yes, enrollment as well. And any additional. Want me to say it again?
No, I'm saying, was that it?
Oh, yes, sorry. That was
That's good.
Anyone else? I thought Board Member Craig, was that it? Hearing none, I will gladly entertain.
Oh, it had to do with the superintendent evaluation. Those putting subsets in the standards,
you have-
superintendent standards.
What were
yes.
yours?
Mine is detailing numbers, I think 1, 2, 3, 5 of these statewide superintendent standards as to what we should be concentrating on within those more general topics.
Any others?
I'm supposed to send the growth 2 cost plans out too.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that it? I will now
A good day.
gladly entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
second.
Okay.
If you could say
Unanimous consent. Everybody
Who seconded
have a wonderful weekend. Thanks to the staff.